There were over 200 guests in the ballroom on the Chesapeake that night, and not one of them could have told you the name of the woman refilling their glasses. She was 27 years old. Her name was Raylene Fontaine. She was 5 months pregnant, and she was working a double shift in a borrowed uniform because the pay for that one night came to exactly what a single round of her foster mother's treatment cost. On a thin chain around her neck, she wore a cheap steel engagement ring because her fingers were too swollen to keep it on her hand, and because the man who'd bought it with 3 weeks of dock wages had been gone since February. The party belonged to Santino Ricci, 34 years old, head of the oldest family on the Baltimore waterfront, a man in a charcoal suit cut in Naples with a faded scar along his left cheekbone that nobody in that room had ever been brave enough to ask about. He didn't raise his voice. He'd never once had to say anything twice. And his family lived by 3 rules that hadn't been broken in as long as anyone could remember. Then his fiancée, Camille Voss, platinum blonde and shaking, pulled a small steel object out of her clutch, crossed that ballroom, and pointed it at the maid. The music stopped. Every conversation in the room died at the same moment, and Raylene Fontaine didn't run, and she didn't scream. She laid one hand flat against her stomach, looked straight ahead, and said 5 words so quietly that only the people closest to her heard them. 5 words that none of them would ever manage to forget. Here's what makes this story different from every other one you've heard. Camille Voss wasn't afraid of losing her fiancé that night. She was afraid of something else entirely. Something she'd been carrying since February. Something she'd have given anything not to see standing in front of her. And everyone present, including the most powerful man on the East Coast, was standing inside a house they didn't know the first thing about. If a story about dignity and quiet strength is what you need tonight, go ahead and hit that like button. It really does help more people find us. Share it with someone who's been carrying more than anyone around them knows. And subscribe, because we tell stories like this one every week. Now let's go back to that ballroom, to the moment the music stopped. 6 hours before that moment, there was no music at all, only the sound of running water in the back kitchen and the quiet tap of a crystal glass being set down on a worn wooden surface. Raylene Fontaine stood at the sink with both hands submerged in warm water mixed with white vinegar, polishing each glass one by one until it became so clear that it nearly vanished beneath the light. She worked slowly, and she knew she was slow. Her growing belly forced her to stand slightly tilted, shifting weight to one leg. Every so often, she paused, pressing a palm into the hollow of her lower back to breathe out slowly before resuming. The smell of white vinegar clung to her fingertips, mingling with the scent of pine wax she had used that morning to polish the long table, and she knew that late that night, after she had returned to her room and washed her hair, her hands would still carry that same smell, as though they had belonged to this work longer than the rest of her had. When the glasses were finished, she sat down on the only stool in the kitchen and began folding the napkins. It was the task she always saved for last, not because it was easy, but because it was the only part of the entire day that allowed her to sit. She folded them into cranes, an old style that hardly anyone used anymore. First came the double fold, pressed perfectly flat with the edge of her hand. The cloth's edge had to be tucked inside, without so much as a single thread showing, and she always began at the right corner, never anywhere else. She folded steadily without looking down at her hands, her eyes drifting somewhere toward the brick wall in front of her, and anyone standing in the doorway watching would have seen in the way she sat something very much like a person, passing prayer beads through her fingers, the same rhythm, the same bowed head, the same repetition that never seemed to weary the one performing it. The banquet manager, a young man with an earpiece tucked against one ear and a clipboard beneath his arm, came in for the second time that afternoon and tapped his finger against the doorframe. He said the guests would arrive earlier than expected, that they were short-staffed outside, that he couldn't understand why a few napkins were taking so long, and that if she couldn't keep up, the company would assign someone else next time. Raylene looked up at him, nodded once, then lowered her head and continued folding. She didn't say that the napkins were supposed to be handled by 2 people. She didn't say that she had been standing since morning and hadn't eaten anything except an apple on the bus. She didn't say that her back had hurt so badly the night before that she had lain on her side until morning and still hadn't managed to sleep. She had learned long ago that every explanation only gave people one more thing to be irritated about, and that people like her weren't paid to explain. The manager walked away, and the sound of his footsteps gradually faded down the stone-floored corridor. Raylene looked down at her feet. The black shoes she wore had nearly lost the entire sole on the left side, worn unevenly in the exact pattern of someone who had taken too many steps across hard floors. And she knew they wouldn't survive the winter, but she also knew they would have to. She finished folding the final napkin, arranged them in neat stacks on a silver tray, then rose, bracing one hand against the table for leverage, and carried the tray outside. What the banquet manager didn't know, what no one in that house knew, was that the company had called Rayline Fontaine early that morning to ask whether she would take the night shift, and she had agreed in the very first breath, before she had even thought to ask how much they would pay. It would have been easy to assume that she had accepted because she needed the money, and she did need it, badly enough to count every bill, but that wasn't the reason. It wouldn't be until everything in that ballroom was over, until all those elegant people had gone home and the house had fallen dark again, that one person alone would finally understand why she had been there that night. That morning, her phone began to vibrate before the sky had fully brightened, and the name on the screen was one she had learned to fear: Elmgrove. The woman on the other end spoke in the voice of someone who had been forced to make calls like this too many times in her life. Gentle, but no longer soft, telling her that Ruth Vance had refused her treatment dose again that morning, that it was the third time, and that she kept telling the nurses she felt better now, that she didn't need it anymore, that they should save it for someone else. Rayline sat on the edge of the bed in her cramped, rented room, one hand holding the phone and the other resting on her belly, and she understood at once what those words, "save it for someone else," truly meant. Ruth had never been such a clumsy liar. She didn't feel better. She simply knew who was paying for those treatments, and she had begun calculating in the way women of her generation had calculated their entire lives, quietly, alone, and always at their own expense. On the bus into the city that morning, Rayline sat beside the window with a cloth bag resting on her lap, and inside it was an envelope she hadn't opened. She had been carrying it for 3 days. She knew what was inside. She had seen the nursing home's name printed in the upper left corner, and she knew the number within wouldn't be any smaller than the one from the month before. But as long as the envelope remained sealed, she was allowed to live a few more days in that dim space between not knowing and having to know. Ruth Vance had once managed the group home at St. Brigid, where Rayline had grown up from the time she was very small, and of all the adults who had passed through her life there, Ruth was the only one who called her by a word other children heard every day without ever understanding how precious it was. She called her child. Not little girl, not Fontaine, not a room number, just child, simple and natural, as though there had never been anything to question about it. So when the company called to ask whether she could take the evening shift, Rayline agreed before she even thought to ask how much they would pay, because she already knew. She knew what a night shift at a house that large paid, and she knew what one treatment at Elmgrove cost, and the two numbers matched so perfectly that she had stopped believing it was a coincidence. But that was only half of it. The other half she told no one, because spoken aloud, it would have sounded absurd coming from a woman who had to count every penny. The last time she had worked at that same house, in the East Music Room that people now used only as a place for guests to stand and smoke, someone had set a wine glass directly on the lid of the old piano. The next morning, Rayline found the pale circular stain pressed into the wood, darkened and stubborn, refusing to disappear no matter how many times she polished it, and she had lowered herself to the floor beside the piano and sat there for a long while, longer than she wanted to admit. No one in that house remembered who the piano had belonged to. No one remembered that a woman had once sat there playing slow pieces on winter afternoons. And because no one remembered, Rayline had taken this shift. She had taken it so she could stand guard with her own hands over the things the whole world had forgotten ever belonged to anyone. The bus stopped, then moved on, and Rayline leaned her head against the cold glass while the rooftops drifted past. The baby shifted once, very softly, the kind of movement only a mother would notice, and for 1 second, she saw Aaron again, sitting on the floor of their rented room the previous autumn, both arms wrapped around her waist, his ear pressed to her belly as he listened in silence. Back then, the baby had been far too small for there to be anything to hear, and she had laughed and told him he was only listening to her empty stomach. He hadn't argued. He had only said he was practicing, that when there was finally something real to hear, he needed to be used to listening. Then she remembered Beatrice Marlowe, and the cloth-bound notebook Beatrice always kept in the kitchen table drawer, the notebook where she wrote down every kind of thing in the world, the price of fish at the market, the name of the new mail carrier, which days the wind began to change, and even the things no one in this world had ever thought to ask her about. By late afternoon, The fog had begun to creep in from the bay, the salty Chesapeake mist clinging to the window panes in a thin veil and gathering into droplets along the edges of the stone ledges, and when the lights inside Hollowmere were switched on one by one, the entire house looked like a great ship anchored in the darkness, glowing from within and utterly silent from without. The windows across the front were so tall that a person had to tilt their head back to see them from bottom to top, rising from the floor almost to the ceiling. The kind of windows people built only in an age when they still believed daylight was a gift that ought to be welcomed generously into a home. Outside, below the gentle slope of lawn descending toward the water, the mooring lines of several small boats kept striking the posts with the rhythm of the waves. A knock, then silence, then another knock. The sort of sound people who had lived in the house for years no longer heard, just as a person eventually stopped hearing the clock on the wall of their own room. Inside, the preparations had begun. Flowers were carried in through the side entrance. Ice was wheeled down the corridors on carts wrapped in, felt so the floors wouldn't be scratched. And everywhere throughout the house, people in black uniforms moved quickly and quietly along the walls, never through the center of a room. It was the first thing anyone in this line of work had to learn, and no one ever taught it to them. They learned it for themselves during their first few shifts, and remembered it for the rest of their lives. There was a rule written nowhere, included in no contract, mentioned in no orientation, yet anyone who broke it understood at once. The rule said that a server must exist only at the edge of someone else's vision, present, but never truly seen. The hand reaching out to pour the wine was acceptable, but the face above that hand was not. The tray had to appear at precisely the right moment, while the person carrying it had to vanish immediately afterward. Through all the years she had worked in the great houses scattered across the region, Rayline had learned how to live entirely within that narrow edge of vision, and she had mastered it so completely that she knew where to stand, so no one would stumble into her, knew exactly how far to lower her head so a guest's thanks would fall into empty air instead of landing on her face, knew to smile when someone snapped their fingers for her, instead of offering even a single word of apology. She had once told herself that it no longer hurt. On most evenings, that was almost true. She walked along the east corridor with the tray of folded napkins in her hands, and as she went, her free hand glided lightly over the dark wooden banister that ran beside the wall. Near the foot of the stairs was a scratch about the length of a hand, slightly curved at one end, and Rayline didn't need to look to know exactly where it was, because her fingers had passed over it so many times that they remembered on their own. A little farther on, just beneath the railing, the wood dipped inward in a hollow shaped precisely like the pad of a thumb. Then came the place where the glossy finish had been worn completely away into a dull patch, worn down by the hand of someone who had gripped that spot every day during the final years of her life, a little at a time, until the wood had memorized the shape of that hand. Not one of the arriving guests that night knew those details. Not one of the staff members hurrying along the edges of the walls knew them either, and there was no reason they should, because they were only here for one evening, while Rayline Fontaine had passed through Hollowmere's iron gates for 4 years, from one winter into the next, entering through the side door and leaving after darkness had fallen, but not as someone who carried trays. During those 4 years, she had come to this house for an entirely different reason, one that no one in the ballroom had known about, even now, on this night. But that part would have to wait. The room was nearly full, and the chamber ensemble in the far corner was playing a slow piece when the great doors of the main hall opened, and the first thing that happened wasn't a greeting, nor an introduction, but a missed beat. The first violinist, a silver-haired woman who had played in rooms like this for decades, looked up once, and her bow paused in midair for half a beat before lowering again. No one in the room said aloud that they had heard the silence, but everyone had. Then the entire room began to rearrange itself, the way a surface of water rearranges itself when something falls into it. A salt and pepper-haired man seated in an armchair by the fireplace, a federal judge whose face was known all along the East Coast, sprang to his feet so quickly that the cushion behind him fell to the floor, and he didn't bend down to pick it up. A banker standing near the drinks table set his glass down on the wood, set it down completely, then wiped his hand on a napkin as though he had suddenly remembered he was holding something he shouldn't have been holding. 3 men gathered near the window, laughing over something, fell silent at the same moment and reached up together to fasten the buttons of their jackets, 3 hands making the same motion at the same time without any one of them signaling the others. Santino Ricci entered the room slowly, without looking around, without searching for anyone. Half a step behind him walked Nico Baresi, a broad-shouldered man with the face of someone accustomed to standing where the light didn't reach. And Nico stayed so close that if Santino stopped without warning, he would have to stop within the same breath. Yet he never touched him. Someone brought Santino a glass of whiskey. He accepted it, thanked them with a nod, and throughout the entire evening, the level of liquor in that glass wouldn't fall at all. Some people said Mr. Ricci never drank in a room containing more people than he could control, while others said he simply didn't like whiskey. But no one from either group had ever been brave enough to ask him which was true. He stopped near the fireplace, and almost at once, a line began to form. Not an orderly line, but the invisible kind people arranged with their eyes, where those who had arrived first went first, while those who came later waited. The first was an aging restaurant owner from Little Italy, whose hands kept smoothing the front of a jacket that had grown slightly too tight, and he spoke very quickly, about a terrible winter, about the kitchen pipes that had to be replaced, about a payment coming due that he couldn't manage, and he kept talking until he had no breath left. Santino listened to all of it without interrupting him once. Then he said only one sentence, that when spring came, the man should return and tell him how the new kitchen was running. The restaurant owner stood motionless for several seconds, then bowed his head deeply and stepped away. And when he turned, his eyes were red. The second was a woman of about 50 wearing the finest coat she owned, the kind people brought out only for weddings and funerals, and she couldn't manage to complete a single sentence properly. She spoke about her son, about how the boy was only 21, about how foolishly he had begun following a group down at Pier 7, and she cried, very quietly, the way someone cried after practicing restraint for weeks before coming there. Santino let her finish crying. He offered no words of comfort, nor did he tell her that everything would be all right. He only said that beginning the next morning, the boy wouldn't be allowed near the pier again, then turned his head by only a few inches, and Nico Baresi nodded once. Only once. The woman took Santino's hand and pressed it against her forehead, and Santino Ricci allowed it to remain there until she released it herself. Throughout the entire exchange, he hadn't once needed to raise his voice above the music playing behind him. People said he had never needed to say anything twice in his life. And they also said that his family lived by 3 laws, only 3, short enough for even a child to remember. No women, no children, no churches. Just as the woman in the finest coat of her life stepped back from the fireplace, Rayline Fontaine came forward carrying against her chest a silver tray crowded with glasses of wine that had already been poured, the kind of tray that, once full, grew so heavy a person had to support its base with both forearms, instead of balancing it on a few fingertips, the way they did in films. She moved along the wall as she always did, her head slightly bowed, her eyes lowered to the stretch of floor just beyond the toes of her shoes, and she was about to circle behind the group standing near the fireplace to reach the table on the other side when a shoulder blocked her path. The bodyguard said nothing, and he didn't look at her either. He was simply there, raised up like a closed door, in exactly the way men in his profession always placed themselves around the spot where their employer stood. And Rayline stopped, stepped back half a pace, shifted the weight of the tray in her arms, and began looking for another way around. She was used to having to go around. Then she saw the bodyguard's hand lower, and that shoulder withdraw from her path. So quickly she nearly pitched forward. She looked up just in time to see Santino Ricci lift 2 fingers from the rim of his whiskey glass, lifting them only the width of 2 knuckles before setting them down again. That was all. Not a word, not a glance toward the bodyguard. And the bodyguard had already stepped back 2 paces and returned to precisely where he had been standing, as though he had never moved at all. Santino Ricci looked at the tray in her arms, looked at the way both her forearms were braced beneath its weight, looked at the way she had to lean back slightly to keep her balance because of her pregnancy. Then he looked up at her face. It was the first time that entire evening that anyone in that room had looked directly into her face, and Rayline knew it instantly, because her body had grown so used to not being seen that it reacted as though touched by a strange wind. The first thing he ever said to her in his life wasn't a greeting, and it wasn't a question either. He said very softly enough for only her to hear, that she ought to let someone else carry that. It was an order, but the smallest kind of order he had probably ever given in his life. And he gave it in the very same voice he had just used to tell a mother that her son wouldn't have to go down to the pier anymore. Rayline stood there with both forearms aching, and she could have said yes, sir, and gone on. She had said yes, sir, 1,000 times in her life, and had never died from it once. But perhaps because she had been on her feet since morning, or because the unopened envelope was still in her cloth bag down in the basement, or simply because this was the first man that night to look her in the face. What slipped from her mouth instead was a bare and simple truth. She said that no one else was being paid to carry it, sir. Then she fell silent, and she heard her own heart miss a beat, because she understood at once what she had just said, and to whom she had just said it. 3 seconds passed, 3 very long seconds, long enough for her to hear even the gentle clinking of the boat lines outside through the crack of a window. Nico Baresi, standing behind his employer, had lifted his head. The bodyguard who had stepped aside stood frozen. And then, for the first time all evening, the corner of Santino Ricci's mouth moved, very slightly, so slightly that a blink would have missed it, something that hadn't quite become a smile before it disappeared. He tilted his head by a fraction, giving her leave to pass. Raylene bowed her head and moved on, her face burning hot, both hands tightening around the base of the tray. At the far end of the room, standing beside the display table with a glass of champagne in her hand, Camille Voss had seen the entire moment from beginning to end, and her fingers tightened around the stem of the glass until her knuckles turned white. Camille Voss moved through that room like someone who had been taught from childhood that every room she entered revolved around her, and it had to be admitted that she did it very well. She stopped in exactly the right places, laughed at exactly the right moments, laid a hand on one person's arm before tilting her head toward another, and wherever she passed, conversations bent toward her, the way grass bends beneath the wind. The older people in the room looked at her and told one another what a beautiful couple they made, what a beautiful evening it was. But those who had spent more years along the East Coast looked at her and understood something entirely different. They understood that what was taking place in Hollowmere's ballroom that night wasn't an engagement. It was a treaty. The Voss family and the Ricci family had fought over every stretch of water, every warehouse, every cargo permit at that harbor for so long that some men had entered the dispute with black hair and left it with hair turned completely white. And there were families in the waterfront district who still kept photographs on their mantels whose stories no one wished to tell. Then at last, instead of continuing, the two sides had sat down together, and what they signed wasn't a document, but a marriage. Camille Voss knew that perfectly well. She had known it since the afternoon her father, Elias Voss, called her into his study and spoke to her in the voice people use to announce a schedule, not to ask an opinion. She had nodded that day, and she had told herself she accepted it. And throughout the months that followed, she had believed she truly did. But tonight, standing among a crowded room of people raising their glasses to celebrate a marriage that every one of them understood had been arranged to bring something to an end, Camille lifted her champagne glass and realized her hand was trembling. She moved the glass to the other hand. That hand trembled too. She passed Raylene Fontaine twice that evening. The first time was near the drinks table, just after Raylene had set down her tray, and Camille stopped, drew in a breath, then said to the woman beside her, loudly enough to be heard, that perhaps the catering company ought to instruct its staff about perfume, because certain smells belonged only in changing rooms. The other woman gave an uneasy laugh. Raylene didn't look up. The second time came about half an hour later, when Raylene was pouring wine for a group of guests near the window, and her hand moved a little slowly because her wrist had grown tired. And this time Camille didn't speak indirectly to anyone. She spoke straight to Raylene, saying that at this pace, by morning no one would even remember who had poured their wine that night, though in truth she couldn't imagine why anyone would bother remembering the face of that kind of person. A few quiet laughs followed. Raylene finished pouring the final glass, set the bottle down with perfect care, said thank you in the flat, even voice that had been worn smooth through countless evenings exactly like this one, then stepped away. She didn't blush. She didn't answer back, and anyone paying attention would have noticed that she didn't even quicken her pace as she left. She had learned long ago that silence protected her better than any defense ever could, and that people only kicked at things that made a sound. What Raylene didn't see, and what the rest of the room didn't see either, was that on both occasions, Camille Voss never once looked at her face. Both times, her gaze dropped a little lower, toward the collar of Raylene's uniform, where a thin chain lay half concealed beneath the fabric, and both times, she stared at it longer than necessary before turning away. Then Camille moved on, smiling at a guest who had called her name, and the moment passed, so lightly that no one thought to hold on to it. It happened after the cake had been cut, and before the orchestra had time to begin the next piece. The first thing Raylene Fontaine noticed wasn't the faces turning toward her, but the perfume. A strange scent, sweet and cold, the kind she had never smelled anywhere in her life except in rooms like this one, and it came over her from so near that she understood the distance between herself and the person standing before her had grown far shorter than her eyes had managed to register. Then she heard her own heart, not inside her chest, but in her ears, at both temples, a thick, slow pounding that drowned out every other sound in the room. And for one very strange moment, she thought that when her shift ended later, she must remember to carry the silver tray down to the kitchen instead of leaving it on the table, because in moments like these, the human mind often clings to the smallest thing it can find. The chandelier high above began to blur into a mottled halo of yellow, not because she was about to faint, but because her eyes had filled with tears without her realizing it. She felt the cold stone floor seep through the place where the sole of her left shoe had worn away, the place she had been telling herself for months that she would patch with an insert from the shop on the corner, and that cold traveled straight up through her foot, through her knee, and stopped somewhere below her waist. She didn't run. She thought about running, her mind did, because whose mind wouldn't? But her legs understood better than her thoughts did. Her legs understood that a woman carrying another life inside her could no longer run in the way people usually meant when they used that word. And she didn't scream either. In her mind, something echoed that she had learned during long nights spent beside the bed of someone nearing the end, that panic had never saved anyone, that panic only made hands tremble, and trembling hands spilled everything. So she stood still, she breathed out. And at that very moment, the baby inside her kicked, so hard that her whole body gave a small jolt, harder than all the other kicks put together, as though the little girl were answering something only she could hear. And Rayline's hand moved automatically to the place where the kick had landed, her palm pressing down, all 5 fingers spread wide to cover it. The oldest gesture a woman knows, the gesture no one needs to teach her. Then her tears fell, and she didn't wipe them away. She wasn't crying because she was afraid to die. She had lived too long at the edge where people stopped being afraid of that. She cried because a thought had just flashed through her mind, sharp and cold as a shard of glass, that if everything ended here, there wouldn't be a single person in this world who had ever called her little girl by a name. No one who had ever known she had been here. She lifted her head, looked straight ahead, and spoke so softly that only the few people standing closest could hear her. "My daughter doesn't have a name yet." 3 seconds passed, and during those 3 seconds, not a single soul in that room moved. Then Rayline continued, her voice breaking in the middle of the sentence without growing any quieter. She said that if someone had to pay tonight, she was standing right there. She wasn't going anywhere, and she wouldn't complain. "But please," she said, "please let me hear her cry once. Just once. After that, you can do whatever you want." The entire room fell silent in the way a room falls silent only once in its lifetime. The silver-haired violinist in the far corner had lowered her bow completely onto her lap. No one dared to breathe too deeply. And behind Camille Voss, a few steps from where she stood, came the sound of a whiskey glass being set down on wood, very softly. So softly that no one should have heard it, but every man in that room heard it. And every one of them understood that what had just begun was no longer about a ring. Santino Ricci began to walk forward, and he moved with the same measured pace he always used when crossing a pier in the morning, not one fraction faster, not one fraction more hurried, and it was precisely that absence of haste that sent a chill through the entire room, because a man who rushed forward was a man who was afraid, while a man who approached at that speed was a man who already knew exactly how everything would end. Across the ballroom, nearly a dozen men reached inside their jackets at the same time, each from a different corner, none of them looking at the others, and before the wives beside them could understand what was happening, they had already been pulled half a step backward. Nico Baresi didn't take his hand out of his coat pocket. He merely tilted his head slightly toward the 2 men standing near the window, and both of them remained exactly where they were, without taking another step. Everyone had expected their boss to do what anyone would have done, to rush forward, to seize whatever lay in that trembling hand, to shout loud enough to bring the entire room back to its senses. Santino Ricci did none of those things. He walked straight to where Rayline Fontaine stood, stepped into the space between her and Camille Voss, then stopped there with his back turned toward his fiancée. It was the most frightening thing a man from his world could do to another person, and everyone in the ballroom who understood such things recognized it immediately. Turning his back meant he didn't consider whatever stood behind him a threat. Turning his back meant declaring openly before the entire room that the woman behind him wasn't worthy of being watched. He stood there, shielding Rayline completely from the room's view. His hands hanging loosely at his sides, neither of them clenched. Then he spoke, without turning his head. He told Camille to listen carefully, because this would be the only time he said it. He reminded her of the 3 unwritten laws his family lived by, laws even a child could memorize, and told her she had just broken the very first one. Not in darkness. Not somewhere people might later argue about what had truly happened. But here, beneath these lights, before every person standing in that room, people who would lift their telephones the next morning and tell others what they had seen. His voice never rose once. Not one sentence was spoken louder than the distant tide against the wooden docks outside, and because of that, everyone in the room had to hold their breath to hear him, and because of that, every word fell onto the stone floor, like a pebble dropping into a deep well. He said he had stood there all evening and heard everything she had said to the woman behind him, every single sentence, and that he had remained silent because he had believed it was merely the business of one evening, and the business of one evening usually ended by morning. He said he had been wrong. Then he paused, and during that silence, no one in the ballroom dared to move. He continued, even more softly, saying that she would lower her hand now, and she would lower it immediately, not because he was asking, but because everyone in the room was watching, and because the rest of her life would be decided by how long she took to do it. Camille Voss stood there, and in those few brief seconds, her face changed in the way a person's face changed only when they suddenly saw their entire future before them and understood that it had just been rewritten. Her arm lowered. Her hand opened. Metal struck the stone floor with a thin, dry sound, and immediately, 2 men behind her stepped forward. Elias Voss had already crossed half the room, his face drained completely white. Santino Ricci remained exactly where he was, still facing away from Elias's daughter, and he still hadn't turned his head even once. There was one thing no one in that ballroom saw, because every one of them was looking toward Camille Voss and the 2 men who had just stepped forward, and it was Santino Ricci's right hand hanging at his side. That hand was trembling. Not much, only the faintest quiver in the fingertips, the kind of trembling its owner might need a moment to notice for himself. But it was there, and it was there for the first time in all those years, the day he still remembered, the day that stood behind everything he had become, was a damp spring afternoon when he was 8 years old. They led the boy out to the black car parked by the entrance, and a man whose face he knew but whose name he couldn't remember opened the back door for him, placed a hand briefly on his shoulder, then withdrew it at once, and told him to sit there and wait, not to go anywhere, that he would come back for him. The boy climbed into the back seat, his feet still too short to reach the floor, and the door closed. A light rain began to fall. He sat there for a long time, long enough that he began counting the drops of water gathering on the windshield, counting from the left edge to the right, and whenever one drop slid downward and joined another, he had to begin again from the start, and so he started over more times than he could remember, because it was the only thing an 8-year-old child sitting alone in a car could do to keep his mind occupied. By the time someone came out, opened the door, and led him back into the house, darkness had fallen. The first thing he noticed was that the house was full of strangers, men still wearing their coats, standing in small groups in the corners and speaking to one another in low voices, and they stopped when he passed. The second thing he noticed would take him many years to find a name for, but even that night he felt it clearly, more clearly than the hunger and cold inside him. No one would look him in the eyes. People stroked his hair, people rested hands on his shoulder. One woman used a towel to dry his wet hair, and every one of them looked down at the floor, out the window, into the glass in their hand, anywhere except into the eyes of the child standing in the middle of the room. At last, one of his uncles bent down and told him that his mother had gone far away, and the man said it quickly, then stood up at once and turned away. No one explained anything more. No one sat down beside him. For many years afterward, whenever anyone mentioned that day, the entire room would somehow drift toward another subject, and the boy grew up inside that silence, a silence thick and soft as a blanket laid over something broken, and he learned that adults could love a child very deeply and still not have the courage to look into his eyes. When Santino was 22 and took control of the family in a room filled with men far older than he was, he simply rose and laid down the 3 strict boundaries that would govern them from that day forward, protecting women, children, and holy ground. Someone in the room laughed that day. Someone asked whether he understood how much those 3 sentences would cost the family. He answered that he understood, and he said nothing else. And from that day until this night at Hollowmere. No one had ever broken them. People had always believed those laws were a family tradition, something passed down from his grandfather's time, ancient and sacred. They weren't. Those 3 laws were only as old as the years Santino had ruled, and they had been born inside a car parked beneath the rain, from a child counting drops on a windshield, and from a room full of adults where not one of them had been willing to look him in the eyes. Elias Voss crossed the remaining distance and reached his daughter, and his face had gone so pale that several people standing nearby would later say they thought he was about to collapse. He didn't embrace her. He didn't ask whether she was all right. He stood there with both hands raised halfway, opening and closing them, and the only thing he could manage was to say his daughter's name once, then again, each time more softly, as though he were calling to someone very far away and beginning to understand that she would never return. Nico Baresi didn't look at him. He looked toward the 2 men waiting at the edge of the crowd and lifted his chin, by perhaps an inch, the smallest gesture a person could make to give an order, and the 2 men began to move forward. In their world, that nod meant take her to our car, not to her family's car. Elias Voss understood. He turned sharply, but no words came out, because he knew perfectly well that he wasn't in any position to speak. Then a voice rose from behind Santino Ricci. Rayline Fontaine stepped out of the shadow his back had cast over her all this time, and she said, not loudly, but clearly enough for half the room to hear, that it was enough, that they should stop. Nico Baresi halted. The 2 men halted. Rayline continued, and she spoke to Nico rather than anyone else, saying that Camille was only afraid. She said she knew that feeling, knew it very well, knew what it was like to be so frightened that a person could no longer think and then do something they would have to carry for the rest of their life. She said that tonight had already been enough. No one in the ballroom said a word. Elias Voss turned to look at her with an expression he would never later be able to describe to anyone. Santino Ricci still didn't turn around, but one of his shoulders moved slightly, and he said only 2 words to Nico. Leave her. Nico lowered his chin, and his 2 men stepped back into their former places. 2 members of the house security staff approached instead, one on either side, and escorted Camille Voss toward the west corridor. She had taken 7 or 8 steps when the heel of her right shoe slipped against the stone, and the shoe came completely off her foot, tipped onto its side, then rolled a short distance across the floor, making a thin, hollow clattering sound that echoed through the silent room. Camille stopped. She didn't bend down. She simply stood there with one foot shod and the other bare, staring at her naked foot against the cold stone, and everyone in the ballroom followed her gaze. No one picked it up. The federal judge didn't. The banker didn't. The 3 men standing by the window didn't. Her father, less than 2 steps away, didn't either. The silence lasted long enough to become something everyone present would remember for the rest of their lives. Then, Rayline Fontaine walked forward. She moved slowly, supporting the underside of her stomach with one hand as any expectant mother does when forced to bend down, and she lowered herself onto one knee on the stone floor and picked up the shoe. She brushed the inside with her palm. Twice, then rose, walked over to Camille Voss, and placed the shoe on the floor beside the woman's bare foot, setting it straight, its toe pointing in the proper direction, so Camille needed only to slip her foot inside and continue walking. Rayline didn't say a word. She didn't look Camille in the eyes. Then she stepped back, turned around, and walked toward the silver tray she had left on the table. About 20 minutes later, after the guests had been moved away from the dessert table, and people had begun lifting and turning over every object one by one in their search, a young server cried out. The ring was there, caught inside the fold of a white linen napkin that had fallen into the narrow space between the edge of the table and the wall, wedged so tightly within it that even when the napkin was lifted, the ring still didn't fall out. The entire room exhaled in relief. The sound of that relief could be heard clearly, one long breath passing through the crowd at once, followed almost immediately by voices beginning to rise again, louder with every moment, easier with every moment, because everyone had just been given a way out of that terrible evening. It had only fallen. It had only been a foolish accident on a night when everyone had drunk a little too much. Someone said it must have been knocked aside while the table was being cleared. Someone else said the display box had been uneven on one side from the beginning. People were almost willing to accept that story, and they wanted to accept it, because a misunderstanding could still be forgiven and forgotten, while something else could not. Elias Voss closed his eyes and breathed out. Someone asked the orchestra to begin playing again. Then, Rayline Fontaine stepped forward. She moved through the cluster of people, held out her hand, and the young server gave her the napkin without thinking, without understanding why he was doing it. Rayline took it in both hands, turned it over, and studied it for a long time. Then she said no. Only one word, and that one word silenced the room again. She said the napkin hadn't fallen. She said it hadn't fallen at all, and the ring couldn't possibly have worked its way inside by itself. Someone began to object, but Rayline had already lifted the napkin, opened a single fold, then folded it closed again, slowly, so everyone could see. She said that every napkin in the ballroom that afternoon had been folded by her hands alone, that there hadn't been a second person, and that she had folded them into cranes, an old style hardly anyone used anymore, beginning with a double fold and then tucking the edge of the cloth inside. She said that the style required one thing, and that thing wasn't meant for beauty but for memory in the hands, that the fold must always begin at the right corner, every time, on every napkin. She held the cloth out before them and pointed to the exposed edge, pointed to the final fold, lying completely off to the opposite side. She said this napkin had been folded backward. She said whoever folded it had begun at the left corner, and people only began from the left when they were left-handed, or when they were in such a hurry that they didn't have time to think. She said it hadn't been folded in the kitchen that afternoon. It had been folded here, in this room, tonight, and it had been folded very quickly. In the silence that followed, something began moving through the ballroom from one person to the next, not through words but through glances, because every one of them had been standing there less than half an hour earlier, and every one of them had seen with their own eyes which hand Camille Voss had used to pick it up. Someone drew in a sharp breath. The banker turned his head away. The federal judge looked down at the floor. At the far end of the room, between the two security men, Camille Voss stood motionless, and her left hand slowly closed into a fist before disappearing into the folds of her dress. A man spoke up, asking who Rayline was to make such a claim, asking what proof she had. Rayline turned and looked at him. She said that the woman had taught her this fold in the kitchen behind them, back when her hands could still hold a napkin. She said she had folded it every day for 4 years. Folded it for someone who, near the end, could no longer see anything at all. Could no longer tell a beautifully folded napkin from a badly folded one, and still Rayline had folded each one properly, because the woman knew. She could tell by touch. Then Rayline placed the napkin on the table, smoothed it flat beneath her palm, and added one final sentence, much more softly than all the others. She said that in all those years, no one in that house had ever watched her fold even a single napkin, but she remembered every fold. Camille Voss was taken into the west corridor to wait for the car, and that corridor was long, narrow, and far darker than the ballroom, lit only by a few wall lamps casting amber circles across the ceiling. The two security officers stood some distance away with their backs turned, the final courtesy anyone was still willing to offer the daughter of the Voss family. Rayline Fontaine passed through that corridor on her way down to the kitchen, carrying a stack of soiled napkins against her chest, because no matter what had happened, her shift wasn't over yet, and those napkins still had to be taken downstairs. She had almost passed Camille when the woman called to her. She didn't call her by name, because she didn't know it. It was only a soft sound, almost a breath, and Rayline stopped. Camille stood leaning against the wall with both hands wrapped around her own elbows, and she had put the missing shoe back on. She asked Rayline whether she remembered her. Rayline stood there without understanding. She said that of course she knew who Camille was, that everyone in the room knew. Camille shook her head, and she did it wearily, as though that answer hurt more than everything that had just happened in the ballroom. She said no, not like that. Then she asked again, more slowly, whether Rayline had ever seen her anywhere before that night. Rayline studied the face beneath the wall lamp, searching through her memory, then shook her head. Camille remained silent for a long while. Then she said very softly that Rayline had once spent an entire afternoon sitting in the lobby downstairs. She said it had been near the end of winter, that the weather was bitterly cold, and that Rayline had sat on the row of chairs to the right, near the artificial tree in the corner, from the time daylight still remained until the lights were switched on. She said the receptionist had told Rayline that no one would see her, had told her twice, and still she had stayed. Something cold moved down Rayline's spine, because she remembered that afternoon. She remembered the office building belonging to the shipping company down by the harbor, remembered the gleaming stone lobby, remembered going there to demand an answer to something no one would explain over the telephone, to ask what had really happened that day at crane number 4. to ask whether anyone had been standing there and seen it, to ask whether they intended to tell her anything beyond the few words printed on the paper they had sent. She remembered sitting there until a security guard came over and told her the building was about to close, but she didn't remember anyone passing her at all. People had crossed that lobby countless times throughout the afternoon, and not one of them had looked at her even once. Camille Voss said she had walked past where Rayline was sitting twice that day, once on her way out and once when she returned. She said she remembered that face. She said she remembered something else even more clearly, that the woman sitting on the row of chairs to the right kept raising one hand to clutch at something beneath the collar of her coat, gripping it and letting go, gripping it and letting go, throughout the entire afternoon, and that it wasn't until tonight that Camille had finally seen what it was. Rayline lifted a hand to her neck without thinking, and her fingers touched the thin chain hidden beneath the fabric of her uniform. She asked Camille Voss what any of that had to do with this. Camille didn't answer. She stared down at the corridor floor for a long time, then said so quietly that even if the two security officers had been standing several steps closer, they still wouldn't have heard, that she hadn't been afraid Rayline would take him from her. Then she lifted her head and looked directly into Rayline's eyes for the first time that entire evening, and she finished the sentence. She said she had been afraid Rayline would remember her face. A car pulled up outside, followed by the sound of approaching footsteps. Camille Voss turned away, and the two security officers escorted her toward the door. Rayline Fontaine remained alone in the west corridor with the stack of soiled napkins in her arms, and she didn't understand. She stood there for a very long time, trying to fit the sentence she had just heard into some place inside her mind, but there was no place where it belonged. When Rayline returned to the ballroom, an elderly woman was standing beside the arched doorway leading into the east corridor, and she had already been there for some time. She was about 70, with short hair, dressed in a dark suit so simple that in a room filled with silk and finery, it was precisely that simplicity that made her stand out, and beneath one arm she carried a worn leather briefcase. The younger people in the room didn't know who she was, but the older ones, those who had been sitting in boardrooms across this city since before their hair had turned gray, suddenly straightened where they stood. Someone whispered the name Renata Cole, and that name traveled through the room faster than the news about the napkin. She walked into the center of the ballroom, placed the leather briefcase on the nearest table, and said she apologized for arriving late, that her name wasn't on the guest list, and that she had come because more than an hour earlier, a young woman had called her, worried about having to work alone in a house far too large and filled with far too many strangers. Then she looked slowly around the room and said she believed it was time for several people there to learn whose house they were standing in. No one spoke. Renata Cole opened the leather briefcase, but she didn't take out any papers. She merely placed both hands on its lid and began to speak. And she spoke exactly as someone reads a last will and testament, without raising her voice, without emphasizing one part over another, simply moving from the beginning to the end. She said that the owner of this house was Beatrice Marlowe, a widow who had lived there when her husband was still alive and remained there after he died. She said that Beatrice Marlowe had 3 children, all 3 of them successful, one living on the West Coast and the other 2 elsewhere, and all 3 of them sent flowers on holidays. She said she didn't blame them, that everyone had a life of their own. She only said that during the final years, when Beatrice Marlowe began calling at 3 o'clock in the morning because the pain wouldn't let her sleep, and because she was afraid, no one ever answered, and that it happened often enough for it to stop being an accident. She said she had been the one who advised Beatrice Marlowe to hire someone to live with her, and that the name brought to them had been recommended by a woman from the St. Bridget group home, a woman named Ruth Vance, who had once worked in the kitchen of this very house when she was still very young. Then Renata Cole turned her head and looked toward Rayline Fontaine, who stood at the edge of the crowd with the stack of soiled napkins still held against her chest. She said that the young woman had arrived one spring morning and stayed for 4 years. She said that when Beatrice Marlowe's eyesight began to fade and then disappeared entirely, the young woman read to her every evening, one book after another, reading her favorites again and again, sometimes until her voice went hoarse. She said that during those 4 years, 2 other households had offered the young woman considerably higher wages, and she had refused both, and she had never told Beatrice Marlowe that she had turned them down. She said that in the final months, when Beatrice Marlowe could no longer tell morning from night, the young woman still sat beside her, still read to her, still prepared the exact dishes Beatrice Marlowe's mother had cooked long ago, recipes she had been forced to learn from the beginning by studying a handful of handwritten pages. Renata Cole paused for a moment. Then she said that when Beatrice Marlowe died, she had left this house, the entire house, every room, and all the land stretching down to the water's edge outside. To the young woman who had read to her, the ballroom didn't erupt into noise. It fell silent, a silence entirely different from all the others, thick and heavy, as the entire room stood frozen, staring toward the woman in uniform holding a stack of dirty napkins. Renata Cole added that the will contained one more line that even she had found somewhat strange at the time. A brief sentence near the end stating that my private papers shall be left for the child to decide. She said she had asked Beatrice Marlowe about that sentence twice, and both times, the woman had only smiled without explaining. In the entire ballroom, no one paid any attention to what had just been said. Only one person, standing outside on the front steps with 2 security officers beside her, heard it through the door that remained slightly open, and that person's head snapped upward. The first person to speak was the banker, and he spoke in the voice of a man who had just discovered that he had been standing in the wrong place all evening, saying that it couldn't be true, that the Ricci family had rented this house for events for years, that he himself had attended several here, and that if this was so, then who had signed the contract? Renata Cole nodded and said that she had. She explained that the house had been placed in a trust under the Marlowe family name, that she served as its legal representative, and that the beneficiary's identity had been kept confidential according to the beneficiary's own wishes. She said the documents had been completed the previous winter, and the rental agreement had been signed the following spring. She added that in all the time since then, not once had the tenants asked her who the house truly belonged to. Several heads turned toward Santino Ricci. He didn't appear surprised in the way people usually appeared surprised. He simply stood there looking at Renata Cole, then said she was right, that he had never read the contract. He said arranging the venue was Nico's responsibility, and that before each event he asked only 2 questions, whether the place was private and whether it had a second exit. He said it with complete calm, and in that entire room, perhaps he alone failed to realize that the sentence had just shown everyone exactly what kind of man he was. Then someone asked the question everyone in the ballroom was thinking but no one had dared to voice, that if the house belonged to her, why was she standing there carrying trays that night? Renata Cole looked toward Rayline, and Rayline looked down at the stack of napkins in her hands, and it was the old lawyer who answered. She said that a house wasn't money. She said everyone there knew exactly how much the annual property taxes in that area cost, that the roof over the west wing had been leaking since before Beatrice Marlowe died, and that she had carried the repair estimate in her briefcase for months without daring to present it, that insuring an old building like this cost more than an entire year's rent for a decent apartment, and that heating so many rooms through a winter by the bay required a sum no working person could ever earn. She said Rayline rented out the house precisely to pay those expenses. She said Rayline didn't keep a single dollar for herself. Then she added one final sentence, speaking more slowly than before, that from the previous winter until now, the owner of this house had continued sleeping in the servants' room in the basement, in the corner beside the boiler room, because it was the only room in the entire building that one person could afford to heat with her own money. Outside on the steps, Camille Voss stood frozen between the 2 security officers, her face turning pale in patches, because she had just understood that the thing she had held earlier that evening had been pointed at the owner of the house where her own engagement celebration was being held. Elias Voss lowered himself into a nearby chair, and he sat down in the manner of a man who could no longer remain standing. People began discussing what should happen next. Someone mentioned the police, someone else mentioned lawyers, and Renata Cole turned to Rayline, opened her briefcase, and said that there were enough witnesses in the room that night for 100 cases like this, that all Rayline had to do was say the word and by morning everything would be set right. Rayline shook her head. Renata Cole said it again, more sharply this time, asking whether she understood what she was refusing, whether she understood what had been done to her inside her own home. Rayline still shook her head. Santino Ricci said nothing. He only looked at her, and he looked for a long time. Then Rayline placed the stack of napkins on the table, straightened her back, and said that she had spent her entire life in rooms where other people made decisions for her. She said she knew exactly what it felt like to stand inside a room while her fate was being discussed outside the door. Then she said she wouldn't do that to anyone. Not one person in the ballroom argued another word. The guests began leaving soon afterward, and they left in the way people leave a place where something has happened that is too large for them to contain, very quickly, very quietly, with no one looking anyone else in the eyes. Cars rolled one after another down the gravel drive. The musicians packed away their instruments without playing a final piece. The serving staff cleaned in absolute silence, and by the time the catering company's last trucks pulled away, nearly the entire house had gone dark, with only a few lamps still burning in the entrance hall. Rayline Fontaine sat on the stone steps outside the main doors, still wearing the same uniform, her arms wrapped around her knees as she looked across the black stretch of lawn descending toward the water. She had been sitting there for some time when footsteps sounded behind her, and Santino Ricci lowered himself onto the step beside her, leaving a respectful distance between them, close enough to speak and far enough that neither of them needed to feel uncomfortable. He had taken off his jacket, and he placed it over her shoulders without asking. She started to refuse, then stopped, because the night truly had grown cold, and she had been trembling for some time. They sat there in silence for a long while. Then he asked how many times he had walked past her inside this house. She said she hadn't counted. He said he hadn't either. He said he had spent the entire evening thinking about it, about how many events he had held there, how many corners of those rooms he had stood in, and how in all those times he had never once asked the name of anyone wearing a black uniform. He said what disturbed him most wasn't that he hadn't known. What disturbed him most was that she had grown accustomed to it. Rayline remained silent for a long time after that. Then she said that when she had first begun working, she had been angry. She said she had stayed angry for almost an entire year, angry enough that when she returned to her room at night, she would lie staring at the ceiling and rehearse over and over all the things she should have said. Then she said she had let go of that anger not because she was noble, but because she was tired. Anger didn't pay the rent, sir, she said. Anger didn't buy medicine for someone you loved. She said a person had only so much strength in a single day, and if they spent it on anger, there would be nothing left for living. So she chose to live, and she let the anger sleep somewhere inside her, and most of the time, it truly did sleep. Santino Ricci said nothing. He looked out over the dark water. Then he asked her, very softly, how her husband had died. Rayline didn't answer at once. She reached beneath the collar of her uniform, drew out the thin chain, and held the steel ring in her palm. Then she said he had worked at the harbor. She said it had happened in February, at crane number 4, and that they had told her a cable had snapped. She said they had handed her a piece of paper with a few lines written on it, and she had read those lines again and again for months without ever understanding how an ordinary morning could end that way. Santino Ricci didn't respond. He sat perfectly still, so still that if Rayline had turned to look at him then, she might have noticed something. But she didn't turn. She was looking down at her own hand. His chest had stopped moving. He didn't ask another question. Rayline continued speaking, because the night was late, and she was too tired to keep everything locked inside herself, the way she always did. She said there was something very strange. She said that after that day, an envelope appeared in her mailbox every month. There was no stamp and no postal mark, which meant someone had carried it there by hand. Inside was cash, not very much, but always the same amount each month, and there wasn't a single written word, no sender's name, no message. She said she had waited beside the window for several nights, but she had never caught sight of anyone. Then she said more quietly that without those envelopes, she would have lost this baby during her second month. 3 days later, he came to Elm Grove. A fine rain had been falling since morning. Rayline was sitting beside Ruth Vance's bed, reading aloud several short pieces from the local newspaper, when she looked up and saw him standing in the doorway. He wasn't wearing a suit. In his hands was a brown cardboard file folder. Ruth asked who it was. Child. Rayline said he was only someone she knew from work, then set the newspaper down, pulled the blanket higher over her, and told her to rest for a while. She stepped into the hallway, looked at the folder in his hands, then told him to go outside. She said Ruth was a very light sleeper. The parking lot behind the nursing home was almost empty. The rain was gentle, the kind that didn't require an umbrella but would still soak through the shoulders of a coat after a few minutes. They stood beneath the corrugated metal awning over the service entrance. He held out the folder. She didn't take it. He said that what happened that day hadn't been an accident. He said the cable hadn't snapped on its own. He said one of his shipments had been in that area that morning, and someone had wanted to sabotage it, and they had done exactly what they intended to do. He said he had arrived later than expected. Then he said that the man standing there at the time had had nothing at all to do with any of it. Rayline said nothing. Rain tapped against the metal roof. He continued. He said the envelopes had come from him. He said Nico Berets had delivered them, every month without fail, From February until now. Rayline remained still. In a perfectly ordinary voice, she asked whether he had known Aaron's name. He said Aaron Keller. She asked whether he had known the address. He recited the correct house number and street name. She nodded. Then she asked one final question. She asked whether he had written anything on the envelopes besides the address. Santino Ricci was silent for a long time. Then he said yes. He said he had instructed Nico to write Mrs. Keller on the outside. Rayline Fontaine stood beneath that metal awning, and for one moment she couldn't understand why those two words hurt her so deeply. Then she understood. She said she wasn't Mrs. Keller. She said they hadn't had time to marry. She said they had planned to do it in the summer, something small, at the church down the street, and they had already paid the deposit. She said that on every document in the world, she was still Rayline Fontaine, that she had never been Mrs. Keller, not for a single day. She said that for 6 months, he had been sending money to a woman who didn't exist. Then she struck him. She slapped him across the face, not very hard, because she had been on her feet since morning and her hand was trembling. He didn't move away. He didn't lift a hand. She struck him a second time, then a third, and after the third blow, she stopped hitting him and only pounded against his chest with an open fist, once, twice, and then her legs gave way. He caught her. She sank onto the wet concrete, one hand braced against the ground and the other supporting her belly, and she wept in the way people weep only after holding it back for far too long. He sat down beside her. He said nothing. Then she lifted her head and spoke. She asked whether he knew what the worst part was. She said that for 6 months, every time she opened her mailbox and found one of those envelopes, she stood there and prayed for the stranger who had sent it. She said she prayed for that person to be healthy. She prayed for that person to be safe. On some nights, she even prayed for them twice. Then she said, very softly, that for 6 long months, she had been praying for him. Santino Ricci sat in silence. He didn't offer a single excuse. He didn't say he hadn't meant for it to happen. Didn't say that he had suffered losses too. Didn't say that he had tried to make things right. He placed the folder on the concrete beside her and said he hadn't come there to ask for her forgiveness. He said he had come so she would know whom she ought to hate. He said the name of the person who had done it was inside that folder. Then he rose, and before leaving, he added one final sentence, saying that beginning the following month, there would be no more envelopes, because she had the right to know what she was receiving, and he had taken that right away from her for 6 months. The engagement was called off at the end of that week. There was no public announcement. Santino Ricci simply sent a brief letter to the Voss residence, and the entire East Coast knew within 2 days. It meant the truce was dead. Elias Voss had been humiliated before every person who had ever sat at a table with him, and a man like him couldn't allow such a thing to pass without taking something back. But what he wanted to reclaim wasn't honor. It was a ledger. Many years earlier, when the house by the bay was still under Beatrice Marlowe's care, the Voss family had rented a row of warehouses from her near the harbor. The arrangement lasted a very long time, and Beatrice Marlowe recorded everything. She wrote it all in a cloth-covered notebook kept in the kitchen table drawer. She wrote down the price of fish at the market, the name of the mail carrier, the days when the wind changed, and the trucks that entered the warehouses at midnight. She wrote down license plates, times, and the names of the men who came knocking at her door to ask for additional keys. She recorded those things exactly as she recorded the price of fish, without emphasis, without underlining, simply because she was a woman who had made a habit of writing things down. For years, the Voss family had believed that the notebook had either gone into the grave with her or lay locked inside the safe of some law firm, and in either case, they had nothing to fear. Until the night at Hollowmere, when Renata Cole stood in the middle of the ballroom and told 250 people that the house belonged to a young woman who had lived there for 4 years, who had cleaned every room and read aloud to the old woman every evening. And until that brief line in the will that everyone in the ballroom had overlooked, the line that said, "As for my private papers, let the child decide." On the 4th night afterward, rain began to fall. The telephone rang at Nico Barrace's house at nearly 11 o'clock. Word had come that Ricci vehicles were being blocked near Pier 7. Nico called for more men and left immediately. Rayline Fontaine was alone at Hollowmere that night. She was downstairs in the kitchen when she heard the engines. Not one. More than that. They stopped outside the gates and remained running. She stood still. Then the headlights swept past, sliding along the kitchen walls, climbing across the ceiling, then disappearing. Then they swept through again. She lowered the pot in her hands into the sink very slowly, without making a sound. Car doors closed outside. She counted 3, then 4. Then she stopped counting. She reached out and switched off the only light burning in the kitchen. Darkness rushed over her, and within it, she stood motionless for nearly 10 breaths, waiting for her eyes to adjust. She heard footsteps on the gravel. They weren't hurried. That was what frightened her most. People only walked that slowly when they were certain there was no one inside worth fearing. She left the kitchen. She didn't take the main corridor. She turned through the narrow door on the left, the door that guests who had visited the house for years had never known existed, and stepped onto the servants' staircase. She didn't need a light. The 4th step creaked, so she stepped over it. The 9th creaked too, so she placed her foot close to the wall. She climbed by counting, one hand supporting the underside of her belly, the other feeling its way along the wooden wall, and reached the landing without making a sound. Below her, the back door was pushed open. It wasn't locked. It had never locked properly, because the hinges had shifted the winter before, and she was the only person alive who still remembered. Someone entered the house. A voice called out, asking whether anyone was there, asking in a tone so courteous that the hair rose along the back of her neck. Then came the sound of a drawer being pulled open. Then another. They weren't looking for a person. They were looking for something. Rayline stood on the pitch-dark landing, with one hand pressed against her belly, and in that moment, she understood what they had come to find. She moved on, across the upstairs corridor, close to the wall where the floorboards never creaked, down the spiral staircase at the opposite end, then into the old wine cellar, where no bottles remained, only empty wooden racks and the smell of dampness. Outside, rain tapped against the metal roof of the row of warehouses behind the garden, a steady sound that swallowed every other noise, and she stood there in the darkness she knew by heart, breathing as softly as she could, listening to footsteps moving above her. She stood in the wine cellar for several minutes. Then she heard furniture being shoved aside. She heard a cabinet door opened and slammed shut with too much force. And she understood something. They weren't going to leave. They were going to tear this house apart. They would keep searching until they found what they wanted, and if they didn't find it, they would return another night, and then another, and she would have to spend the rest of her life in this house, with her ears always straining for the sound of engines outside the gates. She thought of Ruth lying at Elmgrove. She thought of the baby. Then she placed a hand on her belly, and she stopped hiding. She climbed the cellar stairs. She walked straight through the corridor without keeping close to the wall anymore, and her footsteps rang clearly across the stone floor. Someone in the next room cried out. She didn't stop. She went to the front doors, drew back the bolt, and opened them. Rain struck her face. She stepped onto the stone steps and stood upright beneath the lamp hanging over the archway, one hand resting on her belly as she looked down into the courtyard. Several cars were there with their engines running. Several men were standing outside, and several more had just rushed from the house behind her. Every one of them stopped dead. Rayline Fontaine spoke, louder than she normally did, loudly enough to be heard above the rain. She said this was her house. She said that anyone who wanted to cross that threshold would have to go through her first. Then she said she didn't believe their employer would want to read that story in the morning newspaper. No one answered. The man standing closest looked toward the first car, waiting for something. Then headlights swept in from the gates. Not one vehicle, 3 of them, following one another quickly along the gravel drive, and they stopped across the exit, blocking it completely. The doors opened. Nico Baresi's men stepped out. The men standing in the courtyard began to retreat. Rayline remained on the steps, looking toward the final car and waiting for him to emerge. The person who stepped out wasn't Santino Ricci. It was Camille Voss. She wasn't wearing a coat. Her hair was plastered against her face by the rain. On her feet was a pair of flat shoes covered in mud. In her hand was a telephone with its screen still lit, and she raised it high for everyone to see and said very clearly that it was recording, and that it had been recording from the moment they turned through the gates. The men in the courtyard stood frozen. One of them called her name. Camille didn't answer. She walked past them, climbed the steps, and stopped a short distance from Rayline. The 2 women stood beneath the rain and looked at each other. Rayline asked her why. Camille Voss didn't answer immediately. She looked down at her feet, then said that on that night, all 250 people in the ballroom had watched her shoe roll across the floor, and not one person had bent down to pick it up, not even her father. She said only that one sentence about it, then stopped. She continued by saying that she knew Rayline had refused to press charges. She said Renata Cole had called her family's lawyer to inform them that everyone in her family had breathed a sigh of relief, and that she had sat alone in her room all night without being able to breathe one herself. Then she said that tonight she had overheard her father making a telephone call. She had heard the word Hollowmere. She said she hadn't had time to think. She had simply taken her car keys and called Nico Barese while she was driving. Rayline asked why it had to be her. Camille Voss remained silent for a very long time. Then she said there was a name in the file he had given Rayline. She asked whether Rayline had opened it yet. Rayline shook her head. She had brought the file home, placed it on the kitchen table, and hadn't dared open it for several days. Camille Voss said the name inside was Tobias Voss. Then she added that he was her older brother. The rain continued to fall. In the courtyard below, Nico's men were forcing the intruders back toward their cars. Camille Voss stood there with water streaming down her face, and she spoke one final sentence, far more softly than the rest. She said she had already pointed a gun at Rayline once before. She said she wouldn't allow anyone to do it to her a second time. Camille Voss testified that summer, and she testified against her own family, against her father, against the brother who had carried her in his arms when she was still very small. She sat in the courtroom through several hearings, answering each question in the steady voice of someone who had already exhausted everything she had left to lose. And when her father's attorney asked whether she understood what she was doing to her own bloodline, she only said, "Yes, I understand perfectly," and she didn't add another word. After that summer, the Voss name disappeared from the society pages it had occupied for so many years, disappeared from the guest lists of charity events, disappeared from the photographs taken at autumn galas, and Camille Voss disappeared with it. No one saw her anywhere again. It wasn't until much later that people began to hear faint rumors that she was working without pay at a women's shelter on the east side of the city, that she came in during the evenings to wash dishes, fold blankets, and sit listening while other women told their stories, and that she wouldn't allow anyone to photograph her. One autumn morning, Rayline Fontaine received an envelope with no return address, and inside was only a small piece of paper bearing exactly 11 handwritten words. "Thank you for not making me pay for the rest of my life." Rayline read it 3 times, then folded it and placed it in the kitchen table drawer, the same drawer where Beatrice Marlowe had once kept her cloth-bound notebook. As for Santino Ricci, he said nothing to her. It was Nico Barese who finally told her, one afternoon when he stopped by to deliver several documents, and he spoke like a man who had held something inside for weeks and could no longer keep it there. He said the Ricci family had withdrawn from the harbor. He said they had withdrawn completely, keeping not one stretch of waterfront, not one permit, not even the warehouse their employer's grandfather had spilled blood to claim in some distant year long ago. He said that for generations, the Ricci name in that city had meant the harbor, and now it meant nothing at all. He said that several people within the family had protested fiercely, and that his employer had sat there listening to every word, then stood up and walked out. That afternoon, when Santino Ricci arrived, Rayline asked him why. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a while, looking out across the lawn, then said it was because he didn't want the little girl growing up on that money. He offered no further explanation, and she asked for none. Not long afterward, Renata Cole came to see her on a late afternoon, when the air had begun to turn cold. She sat down at the kitchen table, opened her old leather briefcase, and this time she took out a letter. Its edges had yellowed with age. It was sealed with wax, and Rayline's name was written across the front in a trembling hand, the handwriting of someone who could no longer see the lines on the page. Renata Cole said she had kept the letter for 4 years. She said Beatrice Marlowe had given it to her one morning, roughly half a year before her death, with only one instruction, that it was to be given to the child only on the day someone finally saw her. Renata Cole said that for 4 years, she hadn't understood what those words meant, that there had been times when she believed the old woman had simply been speaking in confusion. Then she said that on the night in the ballroom, when she stood there and watched 250 people turn their heads in the same direction, she finally understood. Rayline opened the letter. Inside was a single sheet of paper, and the handwriting was large and unsteady, slanting downward at the end of every line. Beatrice Marlowe had written that she knew the child would hide all of this away, that she knew the child would go on cleaning other people's houses, because she had been taught to believe that was all she deserved. Then she wrote the final 2 sentences. "I am not leaving you a house. I am leaving you a place where, at last, you may sit down." One afternoon at Elm Grove, While Rayline was sitting beside Ruth Vance's bed as she always did, a young nurse came into the room, and she stopped at the foot of the bed, looked at the two women for a moment, then lifted the stethoscope from around her neck. She said that if Ruth wanted, she could show her how to listen. Ruth didn't say anything. She simply held out both hands, and the nurse carefully placed the earpieces into her ears and adjusted them until they sat properly. Rayline lifted her shirt. The nurse placed the cold chest piece against her belly, moved it a little to the left, then a little lower, and then she stopped. Ruth Vance sat perfectly still. She remained so still that Rayline thought she couldn't hear anything. Then Ruth smiled. She smiled the way people do only when something inside them has grown too large for the heart to contain. And she raised one hand to cover her mouth while placing the other on Rayline's knee and squeezing it tightly. She listened for a very long time. No one hurried her. The nurse stood there with her hands folded in front of her, and her eyes grew red as well. At last, Ruth removed the stethoscope, handed it back, and told Rayline that the baby was very strong. Child. She said the baby was much stronger than Rayline had been at that same stage. 3 weeks later, Ruth passed away in her sleep, early one morning before the sky had begun to brighten, and she went so gently that no sound woke anyone. Rayline had sat beside her all through the previous night, and was still there, her head resting against the edge of the bed, with Ruth's hand still held in hers. The baby was born near the end of winter, healthy and at a good weight, and her first cry rang through the entire hospital corridor so loudly that an elderly woman in the next room later asked which baby was making all that noise. She was a girl. Rayline named her Beatrice, but by the second day, no one called her by that name anymore, because the nurse on the night shift looked at her and said she resembled a tiny bird, and so she became Birdie, and the name stayed with her. On her birth certificate, her last name was recorded as Keller. The following spring, the eastern wing of the house by the bay was renovated. The chandeliers were taken down, the heavy curtains were removed, and the very ballroom where 250 people had once stood holding their breath on a winter night was divided into several spacious rooms with beds, a shared kitchen, and a playroom for children with carpeted floors and low chairs. Rayline called it Bee's house. It charged no one anything. It was for women raising young children alone who had nowhere left to go, and it was for people caring for an ill-loved one at home until they were exhausted beyond words, while no one else ever noticed. People who could come stay for a few nights, sleep long enough to recover, and then return home. Anyone could arrive at any time, and no explanation was required. On the stone wall by the entrance, Rayline had a short sentence carved into the surface, cut into the stone without paint, subtle enough that anyone passing by had to stop for a moment before they could read it. The words said that this place was for those who kept showing up when no one was watching. Santino Ricci came to the house by the bay often in the months that followed, and he came not as the man before whom everyone bowed their heads, but simply as a man who took off his coat, hung it on the hook by the entrance, and walked straight into the kitchen. He learned how to prepare Birdie's formula, and he got the measurements wrong 3 times in a row, once making it too hot, once making it too weak, and on one occasion standing there reading the instructions on the container longer than he had ever spent reading any contract in his life. He learned how to hold the little girl without making her cry, and it took him quite a while to understand that the secret was not to hold her too tightly. As for his mother's blue diamond ring, the object that had been used as bait that night, he didn't give it to anyone. He placed it inside a box and locked it away, and when Rayline asked him about it, he only said that some things had to become clean again before they could be given to another person. Rayline, for her part, never told him that she had forgiven him. One spring evening, while the two of them sat on the stone steps, and Birdie slept inside the house, she told him that she hadn't forgiven him, and that she didn't know whether that day would ever come. Then she said that she was allowing him to stay long enough for her to be able to forgive him someday. And that was everything the two of them agreed upon, not one word more. This story, ladies and gentlemen, isn't truly about a gun, nor is it about a ring or a great house beside the bay. It is about something far simpler. It is about the people we pass every day, the person who pours our coffee early in the morning, the person who cleans the hallway after we have gone home, the person who sits quietly beside the hospital bed of someone we stopped visiting long ago. Every one of them carries an entire world inside their heart, a world we have never cared enough to ask about. A person's dignity doesn't lie in the clothes they wear or the work they do. It lies in the way they continue to show up, continue to be kind, Continue to keep the promises they have made to themselves even when no one is watching. And kindness never introduces itself. It simply goes quietly about its work, then returns one day in a way no one could ever have expected. If tonight's story touched your heart, please press the like button so we will know that we told it well. Please share it with someone you believe is carrying more on their shoulders than the people around them can see. And please subscribe to our channel so that more beautiful stories can reach you every day. How did Rayline's story make you feel? And if you had been there, would you have bent down to pick up that shoe? Please leave a few words in the comments, because we truly want to hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. May you and your family always be blessed with good health, and may you spend your days in happiness and peace beside the people you love. Goodbye for now, and we will see you again in the next video.